In 1846, 3 shipwrecked sailors find an uncharted island, but instead of finding refuge, the 3 men find themselves in a mysterious community that isn't what it seems. A trio of shipwrecked survivors named Oliver, Jim, and Ferris is lost at sea. They argue about their location when Ferris suddenly spots an island in the distance. Meanwhile, someone spots them and watches them row toward the beach. They disembark, and Ferris and Jim scavenge the area for wood while the wounded Oliver stays behind. The man watching them earlier appears before the group. Though initially shocked, the group is relieved to see another human being. The man introduces himself as Fingal MacLeod and welcomes them to the island. He invites them to follow him, but Oliver thinks they should build a fire by the shore first so that the other survivors can locate them. However, Fingal insists they should return to his cottage to rest, and Ferris agrees, citing that Oliver needs medical attention. Oliver reluctantly concedes, and the group follows the older man to his home. At the cottage, the men tell Fingal that they're merchants who got shipwrecked due to their captain insisting on following a light through the mist. Fingal dodges questions about the island's exact location and a return boat to mainland Scotland. He complies with Oliver's requests and leaves the group to light a fire by the beach. Meanwhile, Corrigan MacLeod and Lanthy Innes meet up and talk about the arrival of the 3 survivors. They're ecstatic as they believe that the men can help them. Back at the cottage, the men are restless. Oliver checks Fingal's bookshelf and notices a journal. He reads it and discovers that 5 years prior, another ship found its way to this island and that the men couldn't hear the author through the awful sound as he tried to help them. Fingal returns to the cottage and leads them to the Innes home. As they walk, Fingal continues to ignore questions regarding a return boat. Suddenly, Corrigan, Fingal's daughter, intercepts them. She hugs Jim, exclaiming he's come back for her. She then tells the survivors that they're not supposed to be there and should leave at once. As her father orders her to leave, she sinisterly whispers that he should be more careful. Fingal apologizes to the men, stating that his daughter has become mad following her brother's death, and urges the men to move forward. Sometime later, the men arrive at the barn and meet Douglas Innes, Lanthy's sullen uncle. He is not keen on having them, but they gift him rum, and Douglas reluctantly changes his mind. Oliver tries to ask Fingal about the boat, but this time, Douglas cuts him off and urges Fingal to leave. Lanthy wants to prepare Billy's room for them, but Douglas insists that the group remain in the sitting room, but agrees that Oliver take it as he is wounded. Sometime later, they all sit around the dining table while Lanthy attends to Oliver's arm. Jim and Ferris recount the chaos of the shipwreck to Douglas and how they heard someone singing. Lanthy suddenly drops a bowl and flees from the room in haste. Confused, Jim asks Douglas if he said anything to frighten her. Douglas tells him it wasn't his fault and recounts that a few years ago, one of their fishing boats sank and that all the men died, devastating the entire community. Night falls, and everybody is sound asleep. However, Jim has difficulty falling asleep and hears an incessant tapping outside the window. He goes to check and sees someone in white pass by. Spooked, he decides to go outside to investigate further but runs back inside at the sudden appearance of a woman behind him. In his room, Oliver wakes up from a nightmare. He hears a woman calling to him outside his open door and listens for a beat, ultimately closing it when he doesn't hear anything. The following day, Oliver discusses with his men that they should look around to see a way off the island themselves and to try to find other inhabitants willing to help. Lanthy enters the room, and Oliver tells her about their plans to explore the island. She tells him there's nothing out there for him to see and insists that he rest. However, she is okay with just Jim and Ferris exploring. Douglas comes in, and Lanthy tells him their plan, which he disapproves of. Like Lanthy, he insists that the island is dead and adds that the 4 remaining inhabitants are only here because they have no other choice. He tries to discourage them further by informing them of an upcoming storm, but the pair are steadfast in their decision. Jim and Ferris then explore the island. However, Ferris sees that the island is dead and suggests they head back, but Jim wants to carry on exploring. He then proposes that they split up to cover more ground. Back at the barn, Douglas spots Lanthy and Corrigan arguing from a window. He becomes furious, and when Lanthy returns to the house, they have a heated argument and he demands Lanthy stay away from Corrigan. Douglas then realizes that Oliver has been watching them upstairs the whole time. Meanwhile, Ferris is lost, and a mysterious woman watches him from a distance. He becomes frightened by the voices he hears and tries to run, but he stumbles on a stump and loses his glasses. When he finds them, he discovers that the stumps littered across the forest floor are grave markers, and the one nearest to him is labeled Billy Innes, Douglas' deceased nephew. He becomes more frightened and starts running while calling for help. He loses his glasses again again but decides to leave them, and the woman continues following him. Concurrently, Jim is exploring on his own. Fingal finds him, and Jim asks him about the whereabouts of the other inhabitants. Fingal doesn't answer him and instead tells him to return to the barn as night settles in. Jim tries to press him further, but Fingal doesn't budge. He urges Jim to return to the farm, to which Jim reluctantly agrees. As Jim returns to the barn, he finds Douglas, Oliver, and Lanthy waiting for him in the sitting room. Jim informs Oliver the place is deserted, to which Douglas agrees. Oliver then asks Jim about Ferris' whereabouts, and Jim pales at his question. He lies and says Ferris went off to explore on his own. Scared for Ferris' safety, Oliver asks Douglas if they can search for him. Douglas refuses, and Lanthy's face contorts into fear as Ferris' screams echo around her. Her uncle then calls her, and she snaps back to reality. Still frightened, she smiles at him and excuses herself from the room. Douglas follows her and finds Lanthy possessed by a vengeful spirit. He orders her to stay away from the window, but Lanthy slaps him and tells him that he shouldn't touch her. Douglas manages to restrain her and bind her to the bed. Oliver spies on the commotion from the open door, and Douglas realizes someone's watching him. He tries to find out who's spying on him, barely missing the hiding Oliver. Later, Oliver tries to retrace Jim's and Ferris' steps and tells Jim they'll have to find him in the morning. However, Jim spots something outside the window and checks it. Ferris suddenly appears outside the window, so Jim goes out to meet him, but Ferris mysteriously disappears. Oliver and Douglas go to check as well but need help finding him. Later that night, Oliver reads the journal he snatched from Fingal's bookshelf. He reads an entry about the shipwreck Douglas mentioned the night before and finds out that Billy, Douglas' son, was one of the victims of the tragedy. They found his and the other corpses perfectly lined up on the shore. Oliver wakes from another nightmare, and the mysterious woman stands by his door, watching him. The next day, Fingal finds Ferris' corpse entangled in one of the fishing nets. He immediately informs Douglas, and the group goes to the beach to inspect the body. They conclude that he got caught in the storm last night and fell to his death. Oliver suggests they bury him at sea, but Douglas refuses to let them take a boat out because of the storm, so they wrap his body for the time being. Later, Oliver and Jim plot to leave the island that night. When Jim leaves to prepare their supplies, Lanthy pleads with Oliver to stay. He refuses, as they need to give Ferris a proper burial. He urges her to leave with them, but Lanthy rejects his offer and suggests that he stay and help rebuild the island instead. Lanthy becomes possessed by the malevolent spirit again and kisses Oliver. Concurrently, Corrigan senses the kiss and switches places with Lanthy. Oliver tries to stop it, but he starts hallucinating about him making out with both women. Lanthy then leads him back to the house, where they make love while the mysterious woman watches from the mirror. That evening, Oliver wakes up and immediately leaves the bedroom. He and Jim meet behind the barn and depart with Ferris' corpse, but someone is watching them. They go to Fingal's house and steal the oars to his rowboat. They depart the island and bury Ferris at sea. Suddenly, a thick mist envelops them. Oliver and Jim start arguing because Oliver wants to return to the island, as he cannot navigate through the fog. They suddenly hear singing and men's voices in the distance. Jim screams to them to turn about and stay away from the light, but then he hears Ferris calling him. Oliver panics as he believes a ship is coming towards them. Fingal puts on earplugs on the beach and calls out to Oliver and Jim to return to shore, which they eagerly do. They follow Fingal back to his cottage and try to tell him about the shipwrecked men. Fingal tells them it's useless, and he explains that what they heard was the shipwreck that occurred in 1841. He recounts that years ago, he and Douglas found a young woman's corpse washed ashore. Afterward, the land became infertile, and the livestock started dying. With their livelihood destroyed, the rest of the inhabitants decided to leave. Fingal believes that the woman cursed their island and calls her Persephone, also known as the Greek goddess of death. Jim doesn't see the connection between the woman and the shipwrecks, but Fingal explains that she torments men with her voice. At the barn, Lanthy and Douglas argue about the survivor's whereabouts. She becomes possessed again, and her uncle has no choice but to drag her back into the bedroom to subdue her. He later storms outside as he sees Corrigan building a fire in front of his barn. He orders her never to go near his niece again and says he knows what's happening. Fingal and Jim hear the commotion, and Fingal orders the men to stay in the cottage while he investigates. Douglas continues admonishing Corrigan, telling her that her actions will cost Lanthy's life. Corrigan replies that she is trying to stop it. Fingal appears, and Douglas angrily tells him that it's happening again, that Fingal should guard his daughter more carefully and make sure the two women stay apart. In Fingal's cottage, Oliver discovers that no boat can take them back to the mainland, and that all the previous ships logged had been shipwrecked on the exact same date as theirs. The next day, Oliver and Jim head back to the barn, but Oliver decides to explore the island independently. urgently. Jim is reluctant, but Oliver is adamant about his decision. As Oliver explores, he spots a mysterious woman hiding behind a tree. He runs towards the tree but is surprised to find no one there. He returns to the barn, but the mysterious woman watches him from a distance. In his room, Oliver rereads the journal and flips to an old entry written by Fingal's deceased son, Jacob, dated September 20, 1840. He asked his crush, Lorna Elliott, to the Monba dance. Lorna agrees. However, Jacob has some competition from Douglas Pompa's son, Billy, who can't take no for an answer. Meanwhile, Jim is drinking alone when he hears the voices again. Furious, he grabs a rifle and goes outside to shoot the perpetrator. As Jacob heads home from the dance, he spots Billy somewhere in the trees doing the deed with Lorna. He is disheartened since he thought she liked him and dejectedly walks away. Lanthy interrupts Oliver's reading and he asks her again to come with them, but Lanthy tells him that she can't. She hands him her locket and is about to leave when Oliver stops her. Lanthy then tearfully tells him to stay away from her and flees from the room. Oliver follows her, but she locks the door. Oliver peeks into the keyhole and finds her convulsing. Then, a dead woman's face suddenly comes into view. Oliver is thrown back in shock and leaves. In the sitting room, Douglas discovers that Jim has left and decides to pursue him. Jim, however, is now in the woods, ready to shoot the perpetrator. Lanthy is still convulsing. Then an arm slowly extends towards her and grabs her. A gunshot rings from a distance. The following day, Corrigan weeps over Jim's body. Oliver and Lanthy rush to the scene, and he is overcome with emotion. Corrigan is furious at Lanthy and blames her for his death, but Lanthy explains that she wasn't responsible. Corrigan lunges at her, and the two men break them apart. As soon as the girls separate, Lanthy starts to convulse and shoves Oliver away. She loses consciousness, and the men carry her back to the barn. They run into Douglas, who was up all night searching for Jim. Oliver informs him that Jim is dead, and Douglas is shocked by the news. Back at the barn, Oliver demands answers from the older men. Fingal then recounts the night before they discovered the drowned woman. After the dance, Lorna decided to leave early because she was tired. Jacob and a drunk Billy offer to accompany her home, but she declines both. She likes Jacob, which frustrates Billy. The two men start arguing to determine who Lorna wants more. In his drunken rage, Billy threatens Jacob with a knife to the throat. Douglas interrupts the scuffle and tells them to come back to the party, which Jacob does, but Billy doesn't. Lorna walks through the woods alone and is suddenly knocked unconscious by Billy. She wakes up to find the man on top of her. Horrified, she starts to scream, but Billy covers her mouth with his hands. They hear Jacob's footsteps, and Lorna tries to call for help, but Billy smothers her. He inadvertently suffocates her, and she perishes. Billy is devastated, but decides to dump her body by the beach. When they find her corpse, Douglas surmises that she must have fallen off the cliff after the dance. However, Fingal disagrees as he notices the wound and bruises on her head and suspects that one of their boys must have done it. Douglas saw the men arguing the previous day, and the realization dawns on them that either Billy or Jacob will be incarcerated. Douglas then suggests to bury her at sea instead and keep it a secret, but Fingal is stunned by his decision. In the present, Oliver understands the situation completely. Lorna is the cause of all the island's troubles and continues to haunt Douglas and Fingal by possessing their niece and daughter respectively. Oliver then suggests that they all leave, but Douglas tells them they already tried, but Lorna possessed both women, compelling them to drown Jacob. He then tells Oliver that they'll help him escape and to meet them by the beach after they secure the women. Oliver takes off Lanthy's locket and asks Douglas to give it back to her. Douglas enters his niece's room and apologizes for binding her. Lanthy complies and allows her uncle to strap her to the bed. Meanwhile, Oliver is in the hallway, unsure what to do. He withholds saying goodbye to Lanthy and runs to the beach. He finds Fingal and Douglas at the shore with a rowboat for him to escape. Fingal tells him the coordinates to get back to the mainland, while Douglas urges him to keep the earplugs on until the mist dissipates. Oliver then realizes that the fog had been Lorna's song used to lure sailors to their demise. As Oliver gets on the boat, Douglas and Fingal wish him luck. He thanks them and begins rowing away. Elsewhere, Lanthy is possessed by Lorna and has escaped her binds. She goes to Corrigan and tells her they need to stop Oliver from leaving. Corrigan refuses to help her and tells Lorna to let Lanthy go. Lanthy strangles Corrigan instead, and soon, Corrigan becomes possessed as well. Fingal and Douglas watch Oliver row from the shore and dictate that he's on his own and they can no longer help him. They put on their respective earplugs and leave the beach. While Oliver is rowing, he spots three figures in the distance. Lanthy, Corrigan, and Lorna summon the mist to disorient him and make him remove his earplugs. He then hallucinates about Lanthy and Corrigan and drops one earplug into the ocean. Lanthy becomes tearful and doesn't want to hurt him. Oliver then rolls over into the sea to drown himself. Lorna is delighted and relinquishes her hold on the two women. Tired of being under Under Lorna's control, Lanthe and Corrigan jump off the cliff, ending their lives. Lorna howls at the loss of her sirens, and the mist clears as her spirit disintegrates. Oliver resurfaces and climbs back to his boat. He's surprised to find Lanthe's locket on his neck, and then kisses it. The man then rows away to continue his journey out to sea.